Esta presentación será la tercera del panel y daremos paso a otro ámbito desde el que se trabajarán temáticas muy similares. Xiana es graduada en lenguas extranjeras con un máster en estudios de género y en filosofía aplicada. Es doctora por la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona y profesora de la Universidade de Vigo. Sus principales áreas de investigación son los estudios críticos animales, los estudios de género y los estudios literarios y fílmicos, particularmente los géneros del terror, el gótico y la ciencia ficción. Le interesan sobre todo las representaciones culturales de los monstruos. Y hoy nos ha traído una ponencia titulada Wild Encounters, Representations of Human Invasion Narratives in Bear Films. You can start when you're ready. Thank you.
Hi. Okay, I'm assuming you're seeing my screen.
Yes, everything's working fine.
Okay, great. Well, so thank you very much. My presentation will be in English, but any conversation you want to have afterwards can be in Spanish too, of course. So my presentation is about the representation of human invasion narratives in bear films, paying special attention to how the depiction of the bears and the bear attacks has shifted from the 20th to the 21st century. So my work sits at the intersection of critical animal studies and film studies, applying a critique of speciesism and anthropocentrism to the representation of non-human animals in cinema, particularly looking at predators. My research is grounded in the North American context, especially through US and Canadian films set in national parks. These spaces are shaped by colonial constructions of the wilderness, which set up the parks as uninhabited spaces to be protected for tourists, something which eventually contributes to the visitor's sense of entitlement that often leads to human deaths in natural spaces. Finally, to analyze the figure of the bear, I draw on Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka's political theory of animal citizenship, which provides a framework for understanding human-animal relations, looking at liminality and the blurring of boundaries between human and non-human spaces. So the presence of non-human animals in culture is often shaped by their role as symbols. As John Berger argued, the essential relation between man and animal is metaphoric. In other words, animals are rarely represented as individual beings with their own characteristics. Instead, they are used to express human concerns. And this symbolic use of animals has clear consequences in horror cinema. Because animals function primarily as metaphors, in many 20th century animal horror films, they are not treated as living beings acting out of hunger or territorial defense, but rather as threats devoid of context or motivation. The shark in Jaws is a paradigmatic example. It is portrayed as a monstrous symbol of nature's revenge and never as a real animal. Once human control is reasserted, it is dramatically destroyed, restoring the anthropocentric order. Human exceptionalism plays a central role in shaping anthropocentric understandings of both human and non-human positions within the environment. This is the ideology that places humans above other species in moral terms, treating humanity as the primary measure of ethical value. This framework encourages the assumption that humans can never be considered a potential food source, leading some humans to underestimate the risks of entering predator habitats and reinforcing a belief in their own invulnerability. A well-known illustration of this dynamic is Val Plumwood's 1985 experience in Kakadu National Park in Australia, where she was attacked by a saltwater crocodile while canoeing in a lagoon. Although she survived, the encounter profoundly shaped her later reflections on human exceptionalism, and her case highlights how deeply embedded anthropocentric assumptions can be, even among those who are critically engaged with them. A further example of disregarding bodily vulnerability is the case of Timothy Treadwell and Amy Huguenard, presented in Werner Herzog's documentary Grizzly Men. Treadwell, an amateur environmentalist, spent 13 summers in Katmai National Park in Alaska, coming close to grizzly bears and filming their experiences. In October 2003, during a period of food scarcity and increased bear aggression, he and Huguenard were killed and eaten by a bear. Despite his apparent devotion to wildlife, Treadwell's self-image reflected a form of human exceptionalism. He positioned himself not as vulnerable prey, but as someone fundamentally distinct and often superior to the animals around him, seeing himself as a kind of divine protector of wildlife. Ultimately, his failure to recognize their corporeal vulnerability, as well as what Herzog describes as the overwhelming indifference of nature, contributed to the fatal outcome of their prolonged immersion in bare territory. This recklessness, produced by human exceptionalism, often leads to anthropocentric incursions into non-human habitats, both in real life and in fiction, where individuals or groups enter wild spaces with little awareness of the risks. Wilderness has historically been imagined as an empty paradise for visitors, erasing indigenous presence and shaping views of wildlife. Animals were either controlled or underestimated, as tourists approach these spaces with a sense of entitlement that overlook the realities of living alongside predators. Although humans frequently enter wilderness spaces, non-human animals who move into urban environments are often labeled as intruders. Donaldson and Kimlicka describe these species as liminal animals, neither fully wild nor domesticated, but living alongside humans in shared spaces. Although bears are typically classified as wild animals, in many parts of North America, they increasingly inhabit this liminal zone, coming into regular contact with human populations. The double standard of human visitors and non-human invaders reveals the persistence of anthropocentrism, which is so pervasive that even in places like national parks, areas supposedly set aside for wildlife, humans often feel entitled to control animals that pose a perceived threat. The representation of this threat associated with wilderness is therefore not neutral, but culturally and sociopolitically constructed. Filmmakers have sometimes framed these spaces in ways that reinforce the idea of nature as hostile to white human life, often resolving such narratives through a violent logic of conquest in which humans ultimately prevail. Alternatively, a post-colonial and post-anthropocentric perspective that emphasizes wilderness as a shared multi-species environment may help challenge assumptions of human dominance. In connection with the representations of danger, eco-horror is a film subgenre in which the natural world becomes a threat to human life, foregrounding ecological concerns such as pollution, the use of pesticides, or scientific experimentation. This hostility is often expressed through weather events, non-human animals, or other natural forces. However, this subgenre frequently reinforces anthropocentrism by ultimately reasserting human dominance over nature. In spite of this, eco-horror constitutes a significant field for examining cinema's ability to generate effect and raise environmental awareness. When these films adopt ecologically informed and post-anthropocentric perspectives, they can challenge portrayals of nature as monstrous and instead encourage more multi-species ways of thinking. In some cases, and especially in 21st century productions, this leads audiences to side with the animal rather than the human, or to interpret human suffering as a consequence of ecological disregard. The revenge of nature trend is a key strand of eco-horror that emerged in 1970s Hollywood cinema. In most of these narratives, animals are portrayed in exaggerated, monstrous terms that bear little resemblance to the real-world species, as they are typically destroyed in climatic endings that restore human control over nature and provide narrative relief. Although these films often include environmental critiques targeting industrial pollution, mass tourism, scientific experimentation, or the military industries, they nonetheless tended to reproduce anthropocentric assumptions. The animal functioned primarily as a symbolic figure, rather than an individual subject with its own motivations or experiences, reinforcing a worldview in which nature becomes meaningful only in relation to human concerns. So Grizzly clearly fits within the monstrous bear tradition and the broader revenge of nature cycle. Closely echoing Jaws, it relocates the story to a national park, where a giant prehistoric bear begins attacking tourists. Although the film critiques institutional greed, particularly park authorities who refuse to close the area due to economic concerns, the narrative still culminates in the bear's death, restoring human control over the space. From the perspective of Donaldson and Kymlicka's theory of animal citizenship, this framing is revealing. Rather than the bear invading human territory, it is humans who massively encroach upon an already inhabited wilderness. Even so, the film ultimately maintains an anthropocentric logic, in which the animal is constructed as an antagonistic force that must be eliminated. The Edge stages a survival narrative starring Bob and Charles, two friends turned enemies, on the grounds of Bob having an affair with Charles' wife, Mickey. They are stranded in a national park and forced into a struggle against a threatening environment, where survival becomes a test of patriarchal heroism and control over nature. Within this logic, both the wilderness and its non-human inhabitants are reduced to obstacles that must be overcome, reinforcing a man versus nature structure. The bear's death at Charles' hands thus closes the ideological arc in which nature is subordinated to a patriarchal heroic vision of human dominance. Backcountry signals a shift in how non-human animals are represented in comparison to earlier eco-horror films. The narrative follows a couple, Jen and Alex, whose camping trip becomes deadly after they get lost in bear territory. Alex consistently performs a patriarchal masculinity rooted in control over nature, and his choices ultimately lead to his death when a bear attacks their campsite. The couple's trip into the park reflects a common anthropocentric belief that humans can safely enter wild spaces on their own terms, but the bear's presence disrupts this illusion, embodying nature's indifference to human intentions. The fatal outcome underscores the danger of underestimating this shared space and the predators who live there. From the beginning, Alex frames his value as a partner and as a man through survivalist skills, refusing to take a map because he knows the park, for instance, therefore aligning masculinity with mastery of the natural world. He dismisses precautionary measures associated with vulnerability, such as carrying bear spray or admitting to being lost, because they threaten his self-image. His refusal to acknowledge danger, even when confronted with clear signs like bear tracks, reveals how patriarchal masculinity is not only fragile, but also deadly. The scene in which the bear kills and eats Alex presents nature not as a malicious force, but as fundamentally indifferent to human life. Shot in a documentary-like style, the sequence avoids dramatic music or sensationalism, instead emphasizing the raw materiality of the encounter and the unsettling ordinariness of an animal who is just feeding. In doing so, the film resists the conventions of animal horror that cast animals as monstrous antagonists, and instead foregrounds a stark reality. Nature does not recognize human exceptionalism. The bear's survival at the end reinforces the film's rejection of anthropocentric conventions, particularly the expectation that a killer animal must be punished to restore order. By allowing the bear to live, the film leaves intact a world in which humans are not at the center. Cocaine Bear is an animal horror comedy which contributes to this 21st century shift in animal representation, also allowing the animal to survive despite the deaths she causes. The film follows a black bear that consumes a huge stash of cocaine accidentally dropped in a forest and attacks the workers and tourists that cross her path. Cocaine Bear ultimately encourages empathy by displaying the bear with her cubs, including a happy ending scene where they are shown playing in the sunlight, ready to attack the next group of tourists. The film is an example of the recent trend of animal horror films in which the animal survives, humanity is defeated, and some animal advocacy messages are raised. Finally, the recent film Grizzly Nights draws on real events in which two fatal grizzly bear encounters occurred on the same nights. The narrative highlights how inadequate safety measures and poor regulation of human-bear interactions at the time contributed to the tragedy, implicitly criticizing the institutional responsibility behind the attacks. At the same time, it questions the aftermath of these events, particularly the decision to kill 5 bears in retaliation. In fact, the scene in which the park rangers kill a mother bear and a cub at the end of the film is framed as just as tense and emotional as the death of one of the human victims, pushing audiences to reflect on the unfairness of such retaliation. In conclusion, animal deaths in cinema function as key indicators of underlying anthropocentric values. In many narratives, especially in 20th century films, the killing of non-human animals at the end signals the restoration of human control over the environment. By contrast, 21st century representations begin to shift this paradigm. Bears are more frequently depicted as individuals rather than abstract symbols, and in some cases, audiences are encouraged to empathize with them or to root for their survival. This shift signals a gradual move toward post-anthropocentric perspectives, in which non-human animals are granted greater narrative complexity and moral consideration. Ultimately, the question of who is invited home is a political one, tied to broader struggles over belonging and space. Future relations with non-human species can be reshaped through the way in which narratives are constructed, allowing for new ways of engaging with the non-human world. And thank you very much. I will be happy to hear your comments, either here or by email.